This oral history interview of Wendell Lady, former Speaker of the Kansas House of Representatives, is being conducted under the sponsorship of the Kansas Oral History Project, Inc., a nonprofit corporation created for the purpose of establishing an archive of oral histories of Kansas state legislators who served prior to the year 2000. These interviews are funded in part by a grant from the Kansas Humanities Council. Professor Ed Flentje of Wichita State University is conducting this interview at the Kansas State House in Topeka on December 15, 2017. Audio and video services are being provided by the Chapman Center for Rural Studies at Kansas State University under the direction of Tom Parrish. Mr. Lady, from Overland Park and now retired, worked for Black Veatch as a consulting engineer and project manager during his career. He graduated from Kansas State University in 1952 with a degree in architectural engineering. He was first elected to the Kansas House of Representatives in 1968 and reelected to 6 additional terms, serving from 1969 through 1982. He served as Minority Leader of the House in the 1977 and 78 legislative sessions and as Speaker in the 79, 80, 81, and 82 legislative sessions. Welcome, Wendell. Nice of you to be here. We want to have a conversation, and it's unfair to ask you to think back 50 years, but we're going to ask you to do that, and
well, I'll try.
And I know you will, and we appreciate the opportunity to do this. I thought we ought to start off just asking you how you got the political bug. I mean, you grew up in Abilene, obviously kind of where a very famous Kansan, Dwight Eisenhower, grew up. I don't think of engineering schools as a place of political activity. Where did you get the bug to run for office?
You know, I really don't know for sure whether I can answer that question. I had been a member of the Overland Park Chamber for just 1 year.
The Overland Park City Council.
Yes. And I really don't know what started me. Of course, I grew up in Kansas out at Abilene, so I had a strong feeling for the state, and I just decided I was going to run.
I mean, did somebody come to you and say, Wendell, you can do this? And I'm thinking first of the Overland Park City Council.
I don't recall that.
Yeah.
And
you just said, I'm going to put my name out and do it. Of course, Overland Park was a growing suburban community.
Well, it was, and I'd gotten pretty well known in the city because of that experience on the city council.
Had you done engineering work for local government before?
No, really hadn't.
So, would you describe I mean, you were employed by Black Veatch a good part of your career, right?
Right, I was there 43 years.
Well, let's say all your career.
Right.
how would you describe Black Veatch? Did they encourage you, discourage you, or tolerate you running for office?
They just tolerated me. They didn't ask me to do it, or it wasn't for any thing that would help their situation. I just did it, and frankly, I don't recall why I decided to do that.
Did you have to take time off from Black Veatch when you served in Topeka?
No, they let me. I wasn't paid during the time that I was gone, but they were very helpful. Mr. Veatch was. I talked with him before I did it, and he had no objection.
They let you have a leave of absence.
Yes.
You always knew you'd have a job when you came back.
Yes. Well, and then I was there all the time, except when the House was in session.
Well, you served a term on the Overland Park City Council. You got some things done during that time.
Well, I can't say that I can remember the things.
I read that you were instrumental in a bond issue for park.
Oh, I was. I was involved with that, and also the Overland Park golf course, which one of our other members, we played a little bit together, and we decided that we ought to have a golf course on Overland Park. And the city was just very young then. It was only formed in 1960. But we just decided that there should be a golf course, and there was an election coming forth on some parks and
a bond election.
A bond election, and so we just added the golf course to it. And the parks and the ponds and that sort of thing really won big. But the golf course passed by only 80 votes. And so we were very pleased.
Did you recall campaigning for that project?
Yes. Both my friend and I worked at it.
Yeah. Well, you served one term on the Overland Park City Council. You immediately run for the legislature.
I really don't know why that decision was made.
Nobody said, Wendell, we need you in Topeka?
No.
Yeah.
No, I don't know, but just for some reason or other, of course, being born and living in Abilene, I really felt very strong about the state of Kansas, and so that's probably why.
I was curious, when you started your term here in Topeka as in the state legislature, a Abilene resident was Speaker of the House, Calvin Stroy. Mm-hmm. And I was curious if you'd known him before you moved to Overland Park.
No, I really don't remember knowing him at that time.
You remember him as Speaker at all?
No.
Yeah.
I really don't. You have to remember that when you're 87 years old, there's a little bit of a problem with remembering a lot of things that happened in the past.
I have that trouble just last week or yesterday. I looked at the election records when you first ran for the legislature, and you actually ran against an incumbent legislator. And you beat him 2-1 in the primary. You must have had some profile in Overland Park that helped you beat an incumbent.
Well, I received just the fact that I was a member of the city council got me a lot of notoriety that people got to know me through that.
Do you remember who you ran against?
For the legislature?
Well,
No.
the incumbent. It
No.
was Bill Breyer,
Oh, I do remember that. Yeah,
who had to be a fairly young guy
yeah.
at that time.
He was.
Yeah.
And I think he was spending quite a bit of time out in Colorado with friends at that time, and
Okay.
I beat him pretty.
You won soundly.
I did.
Was there any particular issue you remember that you kind of had in your mind when you ran? I want to change this, or I want to do this differently.
No, I really didn't at that time. I frankly didn't know that much about what was ahead in the legislature.
I worked for former Governor Bennett, the late Governor Robert F. Bennett, and you would have served
Yes.
during his term. Did you know him at the time?
I knew him very well, and we were very good friends. I thought a great lot of him.
Was he a mentor at all for you?
Not too much, but I talked with him quite frequently, and we thought a lot of things on the same page.
He was a pro-education guy.
He was strong for education, as I was too.
Yeah. Some of your colleagues who were elected the same year, like Dave Heineman and Jim Magg, remember you being a proponent of changing the way highway funds were distributed. They used to be distributed by the old highway commissioners by districts. Do you recall that issue at all?
No, as a matter of fact, I don't.
Now, when Mike Hayden ran, he argued that all the money was going to Johnson County and not to the outlying areas. So you must have had some influence on that.
Well, I probably did, but I don't recall.
Yeah. You're in the legislature for just a few years, and I think by the end of your second term, Pete Mcgill put you on Ways and Means. Is that something you aspired to do, or was that an accident, or?
I really don't recall. I was just appointed to it.
Yeah. So it wasn't something you got here and say, I really want to be on Ways and Means, necessarily.
Well, I think probably just about everybody thinks they'd like to, because you're in control of the money, and that's. I was pleased to be appointed to the Ways and Means Committee.
And I think not that much later, you're named chairman of Ways and Means. And I think that's by Mcgill.
I think that's probably right, because he was he was on that committee right up until the end.
Did you have, what was your relationship with Mcgill? Was it?
Well, it was pretty good until he decided he wanted to be chairman of the, well, let's see, he was chairman of the, I can't recall, but it was 4 years was the maximum.
He wanted a third term.
Yeah, that was it.
The third term as speaker.
Right, and there'd never been, no speaker had ever gone past 4 years, and I thought that was a pretty good reason, and that's really why I ran.
Yeah. Now, Mike Hayden told me this. He says, Wendell Lady is the only Republican House leader that actually served for 6 years, because you were minority leader, then speaker, and then speaker.
Yeah.
That's quite a run.
Yeah.
Were you a unanimous choice for speaker?
No, it was very close.
You had competition?
Both times. And the first time I ran against
Bob Arbuthnot.
Yeah.
Do you remember Bob Arbuthnot?
Yes.
He was an influential legislator.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what, and I haven't discussed this much with the press or others, but there was a group of young members of the legislature that asked me to run for speaker. And they were sharp young men, and so I did. I ran on their request. And they were extremely helpful when I was elected, because I appointed all of them to important positions, and they just really did a tremendous job in support. Mike Hayden was chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, and there were others that I named as chairman of the important committees.
Well, I look at Mike, and of course, you know I worked for Mike a while and think a lot of him. But he was a rural guy, a long ways from Johnson County. How did you connect with people like Mike Hayden?
Well, as a matter of fact, I spent my first 6 years in life on a farm, and then we moved to town. My father was in the cattle business, and he turned the farm over to my brother, my older brother, and he spent his time buying and selling cattle.
So you could talk ranching and farming with Mike Hayden?
Well, I had a pretty good idea, and somehow or other I got along with that older or the younger group of members.
Yeah. Some folks have tried to say that you were elected by urban, suburban folks as against the rural folks. Is that accurate?
Well, that isn't.
You really saw it as more young and...
There were several of the younger men that were farmers,
yeah,
or lived on a farm, and but most of them, I would say, were not, probably not. We had lawyers and others.
Now, some of your colleagues, Jim Mag, Dave Heineman, remember that you organized and you were the informal leader of a study group that met in the evenings and studied bills and that kind of thing. Do you remember?
I remember that, and they were all, almost all of them were chairmen of the various committees, and particularly that pertaining to money. And we did that, and I listened.
Did you do that as chair of Ways and Means?
I can't recall that, whether it was Dave probably remembers.
Yes.
I can't remember.
I don't recall that kind of a group at other times in the legislature. That's somewhat unusual.
Well, that group thought like I did, and they were a very intelligent group, and they worked at.
And those were folks that eventually asked you to run for speaker?
Yes, they did. I was trying to. I can't remember the man that did came to me and asked me if I would run for speaker, and it's his group that felt that way.
The other thing that I have researched about this, there was a lot of institutional change, constitutional amendments to strengthen the governor, governor, lieutenant governor running as a team, getting rid of the auditor, getting rid of the printer, 4-year term. And in the legislature historically have relied on the budget director, Jim Bibb. Do you remember that name at all?
I remember the name, but I don't remember him.
Yeah. You would have been the first chair of Ways and Means where the legislative staff, Marlon Ryan, gave you advice. That was a fundamental change. Do you remember much about that?
All I remember is that I got along very well with him, and he was helpful.
Yeah. At that same time, I was working for Governor Bennett, and of course Bennett went over the budget with a fine-tooth comb late into the night. You and Governor Bennett seemed to be pretty much compatible on the budget issues.
We did. We talked a lot with each other, and I had a lot of respect for Bob, and so we got along fine, and that helps.
He won the governorship by a sliver.
I remember that.
But carried out the governorship with great energy. I think Dave Heineman told me that you would actually run for Speaker Pro Tem before running for Speaker. Do you remember that?
I don't recall that. You run for Speaker and win after the 78 election, and of course in that election the majority of the House flipped. Republicans lost a whole slew of seats in the House, and you
or elected, essentially minority leader, and who's speaker, John Carlin. How did that work? All of a sudden, Republicans are in the minority, and John Carlin, who's pretty new, is speaker.
John and I got along very well. I don't think we didn't have very many times when we were not on the same page. I had a lot of respect for him.
Yeah. How did you, I mean, one of the issues at that time was that Carlin was promoting was the severance tax. And you had supported that. And how did your Republican caucus deal with that? Because you had obviously a divided caucus. Did they give you a lot of grief over that?
Honestly, I can't remember.
Yeah. You actually, as I recall, ran for governor promoting severance tax too. I was wondering if you had a group of Republican legislators go pound on the speaker's desk and say, you can't do this. Republicans are made of oil and gas. But you don't remember that part.
No, I really don't.
The other thing that I always remembered is, of course, Mike Hayden, you appointed Mike Hayden chair of Ways and Means.
Yes, he had been on the committee before.
Right, he had been on the committee, but you advanced him over some more senior members. Bill Button, for example.
Yeah.
Do you remember anything about that decision?
No, I really don't, except that I just felt that Mike was the best, would be the best chairman that at least that had been on the committee before. And Mike and I always got along very well. He was a good committee chairman.
Yeah. And I always thought that gave him a shot then at being speaker twice, 2 terms.
Yeah.
And then running for governor. I mean, I'm just fascinated how you connected with these younger folks like Mike Hayden, Mag, Heineman. You think that study group was the...
I think that had quite a bit to do with it, but they, to me, were just very well equipped to lead committees and see that things got done right.
One other issue, and I probably remember it because I was watching the election of Mike Hayden. I had worked a bit for him in his election, but I was also, before that, involved with Governor Bennett. And John Carlin ran for governor saying he would reduce electric rates. And Bennett basically ignored him. Nobody's going to vote based on that. And of course, John Carlin wins the governorship after being speaker for 1 term. Do you remember dealing at all with utility rates issue when Carlin became governor? I think the legislature passed it, exempted the state sales tax from utility rates.
Yeah. Well, when was John elected?
He was elected in 78. So you would have been
yeah.
speaker at that time.
Right.
And
that's when I started.
Favorable. But you had a good relationship with John.
I did.
Carlin. Is this a rural background again?
No, I just felt that he was very well qualified to be the speaker. Actually, the governor.
You know, before I learned of your farm and ranch background, I always thought of you as suburban Johnson County. Did your farm and ranch background help you a lot in the legislature?
I don't think so. It helped me just knowing probably more about what's going on the rural areas than others, but I don't think it had much influence on my.
Did you consider farming and ranching as a career?
No, I just wasn't interested.
You had enough of that as a young man?
Yeah, that might have been some part of the thinking, but I went to school or engineering at K-State, and that engineering and farming didn't go together
at all. Well, let me. You served in the legislature during 3 governors. First, Bob Docking, when you first got there, was in his. Would have been in his second term.
Yeah, that was 68 when I started.
And when I researched that era, that was a time of a lot of these constitutional amendments. Bob Bennett as president of the Senate, Pete Mcgill as speaker, Pete Lux as minority leader. They came up with a whole slew of constitutional amendments in the early 70s. Were you supportive of those moves to strengthen the governorship?
I really don't recall those issues.
That kind of, in 76, Kansas got recognized as the most improved legislature in the country. Do you remember that?
No.
I
think that I remember that, but
Bennett was in the forefront of that, and I was curious if you kind of watched this develop and supported it, or were involved in any way.
I don't recall.
Yeah. Bennett, in his first year, wanted to reorganize the Department of Transportation. It was the old Highway Commission, kind of a political deal. He wanted merit appointments and that kind of thing. Was that something you were interested in at the time? Do you recall any of that?
No, I really don't recall.
What about the death penalty? Is that was an issue kind of bubbling up during that time. Carlin said he had let it become law and then vetoed it. I don't recall you being involved in that issue, but I was wondering.
I really wasn't.
Now, a new prison would have been on the Ways and Means agenda too, and I'm just wondering if those are issues I remember during Bennett's time in office. Bennett says, I can get the votes for a new prison, but not for a new prison at a particular location. You know, he started losing votes when he got it located.
Yeah.
Again, asking you to look back 50 years, were there any things you were particularly proud of? I mean, you've mentioned bringing some of these young folks into decision-making. Dave Heineman mentioned advancing women into committee chairs and vice chairs. Anything that stands out as you look back?
Well, I was very pleased with the way these young men took over and helped me be speaker, because they chaired the committees and we met regularly, and everything, it seemed to me, worked out very well. And I think that I made the right decision in getting those younger men involved. There was some thinking of the older and a lot of the members from the farms. I just think that they weren't really fully aware of what needed to be done.
The politics have changed since you were here in the 70s and early 80s. And I'm always curious if you saw any of these things coming, like the struggle over abortion. I don't recall that being much of an issue during your legislative service. Do you recall it ever coming up at all? I don't recall. I don't think it did. And of course, later, were these folks that wanted to cut taxes, cut the budget, and those kinds of things. And the 70s and 80s were kind of expansive times.
Yeah.
I mean, taxes was always an issue, but there was pretty broad bipartisan support for an expanded state obligation for welfare and roads and education, universities, and those things. And I don't recall during your term somebody drawing the line on this. It was pretty much a broad agreement.
Yeah, I think it was pretty much, but I always had support of the Ways and Means Committee, and that's, that's where really the biggest decisions are being made in the legislature, and they helped.
Now, the Speaker has broad authority under House rules. How would you describe your style as Speaker? Did you say, here's where we're going and everybody follow, or were you, how would you describe your style?
Well, my style was to work with the people at the Ways and Means Committee. We met regularly, and we'd talk about it, and I don't think that I was making decisions strictly on my own.
You weren't an authoritarian speaker.
I don't think so.
Yeah.
Of course, probably there's never been a speaker that would claim for that.
During your, actually in this time period, Democrats won control of the House in 78. No, 76, when you would have been on Ways and Means. Were you involved as speaker or minority leader in recruiting candidates for Republican candidates?
I really don't recall that too much. Of course, I had so many things on my mind then as Speaker of the House.
Yeah, I was curious about that. You were there, you saw at least 3 governors. You saw a number of legislative leaders, Stroig, Mcgill, Carlin. Was there anyone that stood out as having really great leadership skills?
Well, of course, I felt very strongly about Bob Bennett, but I think John Carlin did a good job. He and I got along very well. I'm sure had differences of opinion at the time, but I think I think he respected me and I did him as well.
Did you have a chance to observe this friction between Robert Bennett and Gar at all?
I heard a lot about that.
You heard a lot about it? I never particularly understood it, but obviously it's in your neighborhood, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, I got along with both of them. I think probably I agreed with Bennett mostly on the issues, but I didn't have any bad feelings toward either one of them.
Now, you served your 2 terms as Speaker, and you decided to run for governor. How did you make that decision?
Well, I guess I felt that I could be a good governor, and I knew that I had the experience here in the legislature and made a lot of contacts with people. But there were 2 of us running from Johnson County, and that wasn't a good idea. But in the primary, somebody from Wichita won, and so that took care of that.
Did you, well, let me back up. Were you always a Republican?
Yes, I was, but I didn't always agree with what went on in the Republican Party.
Yeah. When do you remember kind of veering away from the Republican line?
Well, I think during the time that I was here, I think I probably came to that conclusion, but I don't know. I'm smart enough to know that I don't have all the answers.
Yeah. I don't recall after the primary, you lost that primary. Were you asked to embrace the Republican nominee, or were you kind of quiet in that election? Or
I think I was pretty quiet.
I saw your name on a group of traditional Republicans, I think they called themselves traditional Republicans, that objected to what the state did on taxes here a couple of years ago. I take it you weren't enamored with what the state was doing on
Well, one of the things that affected me more than anything was the split, or my mind's getting a little bit,
Take your time.
yeah. And it just,
the traditional Republican group is a group, I know, organized by Rochelle Conister and a number of former Republican leaders. And in 2012, when this tax plan was promoted, they spoke out against it. And then in 2014, they actually endorsed Davis, as I recall, for governor, the Democrat running against Brownback, who was running for re-election. I'm kind of curious, after your service and after running for governor, how active you stayed.
I really haven't been very active.
Did you miss it? You were appointed to the Regents too,
Yes.
to the Board of Regents for a while, so you stayed active there, I assume.
Yes. You know, one thing that I felt the strongest about was the money, the spending of money, and I felt that we should have increased. At that time, we were the money was less than 50%. And I felt that it ought to be increased to 50%.
For schools.
For schools, for education. I was always strongly increasing that, and education, of our people is most important, and I really felt that we had not done, and I don't know what it is now. At that time, it was less than 50%. And I don't know what it is. You know?
It's actually more now.
Is it more now?
But I remember Bennett arguing for that too. We need to reach at least 50% state participation in school.
Yeah.
School funding.
That was, and I tried to see that was happened, but I wasn't able to get that done.
Well, it took a while to get it done, and we're still struggling.
What is the percentage now? Do you know?
Well, it depends on how you count it. There's a 20 mil statewide levy for schools, and then there are local levies for schools. So do you count the 20 mills as local or state?
Yeah.
Even the research department here is not sure where it should be counted.
Well, I think at that time it was completely the state monies was what was financing schools. And I don't know, it may have been some outside, but that was the thing that bothered me the most during the time that I was in the legislature and afterwards, that we didn't do something about increasing the percentage of money given toward education.
You remember working on that as chair of Ways and Means, or as speaker, or both?
Yes, I was working on that, but I've been thinking about it ever since, that I just felt that we were not spending enough money on education.
Well, Wendell, we've about exhausted my questions, but I'm sure I'm missing something.
Well, I think you've covered it pretty well.
You sure? Haven't I missed something that we need to talk about?
I don't think so.
How do you remember the time? I mean, was this a great time in your life, or do you?
I look back, I was very, very pleased with what I had tried to do, even if we didn't get it done.
You pretty much, after running for governor, 2 terms as speaker, you went home, worked for Black Veatch.
Yeah, I've been very much involved in the large church, Methodist church that we built starting in 1994. We had the first building. So I've been involved, being an engineer. The pastor asked me to help, and I handled 3 projects in it now. That church has a membership of 20,000 people, and it's increased at another 1,000 since the end of the year. And I've spent a lot of time with that.
And that's a fulfilling kind of work.
It really is. I feel very, very good about participating in that.
Do your kids have political ideas?
I think they have ideas, but they haven't participated.
They haven't run for office?
No, I don't think so. I think they figured that I had enough trouble. They didn't need to.
Well, I haven't heard of any troubles you had. Everything seemed to go pretty smoothly.
Well, I'm pleased with the way it went, but
you should be.
Yeah.
You should be. Well, I think we'll bring this to a close. Thank you for coming over today and sitting in the speaker's chair.